Welcome back, everyone, to our NASCAR Heat 2 coverage here on Knee Pit Gaming. Today's video is all about Auto Club Speedway in California. Now, for the purposes of this video, we will only be covering the Xfinity cars as well as the Monster Energy Cup cars because those are the only two series in the game that are allowed to run at this speedway. The trucks are not allowed to run here, so we'll only be covering the two series that are. We're going to be talking about not only the setup, but we're going to be talking about lap times and also the approach to the track and some tips on how to get maximum speed. So without further ado, let's head to the racetrack. We're going to begin our discussion in the Xfinity cars. But before we get into the setup itself and the lap times, I want to talk a little bit about the track itself. This is a big, wide track. There are many grooves to run, probably 3, 4, 5 different grooves that you could easily run around the track. And the track, particularly in the Xfinity car, can be run wide open if you desire. I don't necessarily advise it, and I don't get my quickest lap times that way, which is why I don't advise it. But it can be done if you decide to. Also, if you want to run the extreme top of the track, then that can be done. It takes a little bit different technique than running the bottom, but there are many possibilities here. Running around the top feels great in the cars. However, it's just slow. Because of how much time you're going to spend on the throttle here, running the high line for speed just really isn't a viable option for me. So let's talk a little bit about lap times. Lap times here in the Xfinity car for me, a great lap would be somewhere in the 39.6 range with normal laps in the 39.7, maybe sometimes creeping up into 39.8 second range, just depending on how much I overdrive the entry. That is the one thing I tend to do more than anything is drive the car too hard into the corner, which makes it harder for me to get down to the bottom where I want to be on the apex, and then of course hurts my entry as well. So that's what I struggle with. So anywhere in the 39.7, 39.8 second range, you're going to be perfectly fine. And even a good bit slower than that, and you will easily outrun the AI on maximum difficulty. At the end of this video, I'm going to show a short race against the AI in the Xfinity cars on maximum difficulty, and you can see that they quickly fade away in our rearview mirror and are not an issue. But the main reason I wanted to show this recorded footage is to give you an idea, because I spend the race running some different routes around the track. Sometimes I will run the bottom groove, sometimes I'll run the middle, and maybe sometimes a little bit higher, and you can see how that affects as my entry, middle of the corner, and exit change, how that affects the lap times. You're extremely hard on the gas at all times on this track. The only real time to feather the throttle a little bit, to lift at all, would be just a little bit on entry. What I try to do on entry is run the car extremely wide and keep out by the fence as long as I can before lifting off just a little bit so that I can bring the car all the way down to the bottom, reaching the bottom at or before the apex of the corner or the center of the corner, and then simply let the car float out toward the wall on exit. And that keeps the car as freed up as possible, and it doesn't get the car bound up. So the more you can do that, the faster your lap times will be. But again, there's many ways around the racetrack. I simply have found that to be the fastest for me. All right, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the setup itself. This is a little different than what I have posted in the past for other tracks and last year's game as well. But I like it because it keeps me interested. It gives me a little bit of a different style of setup to use. So let's go ahead and talk about it. First up, the shock settings. This is an extremely bumpy track. And the shock settings are one of the things you can do to help negate that, or at least reduce the impact of the bumps. Now, I can tell you with this setup, I barely even remember that the bumps exist on the track. In fact, unless I hit one just right, I almost forget that the bumps are even there. That's how well that this setup absorbs the bumps, which is why it is what it is and why it's able to be so fast. So 5 across the board on bump and rebound for all 4 corners of the car. Again, this helps to absorb the bumps, but feel free, as always, to play around with all these settings and see what works best for you. Now let's move on to the weight. Left side weight is maxed out at 54.2% on all the ovals. Front weight or nose weight is at 51%, a little bit higher than I'm used to, but this car rotates extremely well, and I had to move some nose weight in it just to keep it under control and keep it from losing stability too much. Wedge is at 51.3. Again, wedge is primarily to give some feel to the car and also to keep your rotation under control. One of the things you don't want to do on this track, because of how wide it is and how much you want to arc the corners, one of the things you don't want to do is steer too much. You don't want to oversteer the car because it will get loose in a hurry. So the wedge is one of the ways you can help control that. But the wedge number is going to be based off of how aggressive you are with the steering. 51.3 works good for me. The front and rear ride heights are both at minimum, so nothing to talk about there. Now let's move on to the spring settings. The front springs, 700 and 800 on the left and right front springs respectively. And that is a departure from what I normally run. And the reason for that is the softer springs help to absorb the bumps more. And the 700 and 800 pound springs, that gives you about 100 pounds of front spring split, which helps to tighten up the car a little bit, give a little feel to the steering, because it's very easy to lose the feel in this particular game because of the weakness overall of the force feedback. So that gives it a little bit of feel and also helps to control the car from getting a little bit too loose on entry. Moving on to the rear springs, left rear at 300, right rear at 500. That gives you 200 pounds of rear spring split, which helps the car to rotate. The more rear spring split you have, the more the car will be open to rotating, and you have to be careful about it actually becoming loose, particularly on the exit of the corner. So that's how I modulate those. If the car is rotating well, then I know my rear spring split is in good shape, particularly under throttle. Tire settings, I don't mess with a whole lot in general. I believe these are close to the default, but I can't remember what the default are at this point. So tire settings are something that I generally try to get the tires to be more or less what I would call properly inflated, where the middle tire temperature is between the inside and the outside somewhere. It doesn't have to be exact, and it's not going to be perfect, but I haven't really found that it makes a whole lot of difference in the game. The primary thing that I like to look at here, if I'm going to make any adjustments, is in the split between the left sides and the right sides. For example, on the front, you can see that we have 6 pounds of split between the pressure on the left side and the pressure on the right side. So that's 6 pounds. If I increase that to 8 or 10 or maybe even more, that should help the car to rotate. Same thing in the rear. Generally, whenever I do this, I do the same for the front and rear, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. But again, if you want the car to rotate better, then simply increase the split between the left and right sides, either by decreasing the left sides or increasing the right sides. Either one will work. Moving on to the miscellaneous settings, the left front and right front camber both maxed out at 10 and -10 respectively, and that's simply to help the car turn, and there seems to be no negative side effects of running that much camber, even though in real life that would be very interesting to do. The front sway bar is at 1.15 inches, and that's less than what I'm used to, again, just to try to help the car to absorb some of the bumps. The lower the number you use here, the better in general it will absorb the bumps, but of course everything has a balance that you're looking for. No rear sway bar here, although it's definitely something that you could use to try to help the car to rotate through the corners. I just didn't feel like it was needed in my case. Moving on to the track bar, you can see that both the left and right sides are at 10 inches. And again, this is modulated based off of primarily the overall rotation of the car, and particularly from the center of the corner off. The car is rotating nice, so I really don't need to go any higher than that. Brake bias is really only used here if you're talking about a green flag pit stop or to dodge the AI maybe on corner entry or something. So I try to keep it in general, between 70 and about 75 or 76, just to try to keep enough front brake in it so that whenever I'm braking heavy for a pit stop, I don't get the car too out of shape and risk spinning it out. Grill tape, I don't spend a whole lot of any time on because it doesn't seem to make much of any difference in the game, if any difference at all. 50% doesn't have the car overheating, and that's pretty much all I care about. Wheel lock, I keep standard at 10 degrees along with the steering offset, which is normally for me around the 0.1 range. The reason why these two don't change very much is because for the wheel lock in particular, I don't like the way the changes to this number make the steering feel. Your results may vary, but for me, If you reduce this number to down to 9 or 8 or whatever the minimum is, then you make the steering more sensitive. If you increase this number to 11, 12, and so on, then you make the steering less sensitive, which would mean less sensitive, meaning that you would have to turn the wheel more to get the same result as you would have with more sensitive steering. So I don't like the way that feels in the car. If I'm going to adjust the steering sensitivity, I prefer to do so using the options menu and doing it that way, not this way. It just feels a little bit too weird for me and almost accentuates the dead zone that's already in the wheel. The steering offset is used to offset the amount of pull to the left that you're going to have. Now, pretty much any fast setup that you make on an oval is going to pull hard to the left on the straights. And that's because the car is made to go left and not straight. Well, you can offset that using the steering offset. And the more you increase this, the more you go to the right or increase this number, the more it's going to offset that pull to the left and make the car want to go more straight on the straightaways. Just be careful about going too high. You get the car with too much steering offset, and it can actually start to pull to the right on the straights, which is very disconcerting when you're used to turning left all the time. Finally, the gear settings. I don't mess with the first through fourth gears, particularly anywhere except for a road course in general, because I'm only going to use them very sparingly on a start or a restart or something. I'm not terribly worried about that. I primarily worry about the rear end ratio, which is at 3.07 for this setup. And in general, I try to keep it somewhere around 8,000 RPMs for the most part. So anywhere between 7,500 and 8,500 is generally okay. On some tracks, you won't notice much of any difference, even if you go above that. So whatever feels best for you, feel free to increase that or decrease that. And who knows, you might pick up some speed here or there in the process. But again, with the AI, they're going to be nowhere near you if you're running anything close to a 39.7 or 8, anything like that. So don't worry so much about the AI. Just go out there, have fun, learn the track, and you'll find that your lap times get better the more comfortable you get. So that'll take care of the Xfinity car. Let's go now and talk briefly about the Cup car. Now that we've spent a lot of time on the setup and talking about the track itself with the Xfinity cars, we're not going to do a lot of that with the Cup cars. There's only a few things here I want to mention. First and foremost, you'll notice by comparing this setup to the Xfinity car setup, you'll notice that they're very close. And in general, front weight, wedge, all those things are very close to what you're going to see in the Xfinity car. And that's because they drive very similar. The obvious difference here being that the Cup car has more power and therefore is running much faster speeds around the track. For that reason, I generally try to deal with stability a little bit more in the Cup car. So I generally start off by setting up the Xfinity car. Once I have a good baseline there, then I can move over to the Cup car, make the car a little bit more stable, and that will in general give me what I need. The most important differences probably would be right front spring, a little bit stouter here, and the reason is just to give the car a little bit more stability, particularly on corner entry. And then the track bar is a little bit different, basically to account for a little bit different feel that I'm looking for in this car because of the little bit less stability and a little bit more horsepower. But overall, very similar, and even the gearing is very similar. Now, what I'm going to show you next is a short race against the AI. The most important things here to pay attention to are not the AI because they're going to quickly disappear since they're so much slower. The important thing is to pay attention to the entry, the center, and the exit of the corner, because what I'm going to do is run some different grooves around the track. I'm going to have some different approaches to the entry, different approaches to the exit of the corner, and so on. And you can get an idea of how those affect the lap time. Now, I don't run the fastest laps in this race. I think my quickest lap time in this race is somewhere around a 39.8. So it's not so much about the lap time, but looking at how the lap times can vary as you run different styles and different grooves around the racetrack. So thank you very much for joining me. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section. And we have a great community that we're building here at Pit Gaming. And if it's not something I can answer, I'm sure one of our other community members will be glad to help. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned for more NASCAR Heat 2 coverage here at Pit Gaming.